Okay, so I noticed this week that you seem to have struggled with Module 2 quiz and answering the questions. I did look at some of your answers and I saw that you did not use all the 3 attempts that are available. Sometimes you used only 2, sometimes only 1. Don't be in a hurry to go through the quiz. They're open and available to work on throughout the course. You can start it, you can stop it and go back and continue. You can go back and forth with the questions. So if you want to pause one question, you've tried it once, it didn't work out, you can move to the next question and then come back to that question and work on it a second time. Or you can have time to review the topic through the textbook and maybe even come back to it another day. One little trick you could use that can be helpful is to click on the full book. So you have your question open. If you click on the full book, you might notice it opens up to the side. So let me open the actual quiz here. And so I can pick a question and work on it while I'm on the book. So I can go on chapter 2. This was module 2 quiz, which actually I think that was chapter 3. There we go. And for example, look at the question. A supposed Ireland and Slovakia both produce boots and wheat. The opportunity cost of producing a bushel of wheat is 6 pairs of boots, while Slovakia's opportunity cost is 6. So we know we're talking opportunity cost. Maybe I need the production possibility frontiers, right? And I can look it up here. Or you can do your first attempt, find out what you need to review, and then look it up on the textbook. And you can have the textbook side to side, which can be helpful. So you can scroll through it. So you can look at the graphs if you think you need a graph. Comparative advantage, just look at all the and opportunity cost. So this was the one that we were maybe looking at the most. How do we figure out the opportunity cost? And we can look at the example as we're working on the question. So this can be a useful tool. I'm going to open the question in my, because I don't think I have any more attempts left for question number 1. I can actually just open it and show you. So in this question, it's asking you to pretty much interpret the graph. You have 2 graphs, straight curve, bowed out shape curve. When we have a straight curve, we know that the production of the 2 goods is not specialized. And the opportunity cost is constant between pressure cookers and air fryers. When we have a bowed out curve like graph number 2, we know that there's a specialization. What does it mean? That some resources are more apt to producing more pressure cookers versus air fryers or vice versa. When it's bowed out like that, the opportunity cost of producing the good that is on the x-axis, so in this case the air fryers here, would be higher in the bottom part of the curve, and the opportunity cost of producing pressure cookers versus air fryers up here is going to be lower because we have a flatter curve. So that is something to keep in mind if we're looking at a specialized economy. In this example specifically, it says, suppose Australia produces only pressure cookers and fryers, and the resources that are used in the production of these 2 goods are not specialized. So it says not specialized. Boom. I know I'm talking about graph number 1. This is what I want. Graph number 1. It's a straight line. Because it's a straight line, it's not specialized. I know that the question here is the opportunity cost of producing each additional air fryer will remain constant. And that was the correct answer for question number 1. Now moving on to question number 2. Based on the previous description, the trade-off Australia faces between producing air fryers and pressure cookers is best represented by graph 1, because we know it's a constant opportunity cost. If the question had said that the opportunity cost had said that the resources used in the production of the 2 goods are specialized, so it was specialized, then we would have focused on graph number 2. And if it asked to increase air fryers, the bottom one, we would have said that the opportunity cost increased. If it asked you about pressure cookers, we would have said that the opportunity cost decreased. And then we would have selected graph 2 for the second part of the question. And I cannot try another version on this one just to show you, because I think I've exhausted all my versions. So I can only continue to the next one. Now on this one, we have two farmers that own an 18 acre plot of land. And this is their graph. I'd already answered this and there was a small mistake in my answer. So I'm going to try another version to have it fresh, because I didn't draw the graphs. So we need to be accurate in drawing the graphs, because you can be penalized. See, I lost half a point and there was a minor mistake on the graph because I wasn't paying attention. So Elijah and Anisha are farmers. Each one owns a 16-acre plot of land, and this is their schedule of production, right? They can produce 8 pounds of zucchini per acre or 8 pounds of watermelon per acre. I already know here that the opportunity cost to produce 1 pound of watermelon is one, or the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of zucchini is 1, because I'm going to divide 8 by 8. The opportunity cost for Anisha instead is for each pound of watermelon is going to be, each pound of zucchini is going to cost 4 pounds of watermelon. So we already know that Anisha does not have a comparative advantage in the production of watermelon, because it has to give up 4 watermelons for each pound of zucchini, versus Elijah only gives up 1 pound of watermelon for 1 pound of zucchini. And you feel free to write it down on a piece of paper so that you memorize, you keep that in mind and you don't, get all confused. So now on the following graph, I need to graph the production possibility curve. It's going to be a straight curve. It says each farmer chooses whether to devote all the acres to producing watermelon or zucchini, or vice versa. So with Elijah, if it produces only watermelon, we said it's 8 pounds per acres and we have 16 acres. Let's pull up the calculator. We're going to do 16 acres times the 8 pounds per acre. So it's 128. And I know it's going to be 128 for the zucchini because we have 8 pounds of zucchini too. So I need to get this line, click on it, start dragging it here, and the intercepts are going to be 8. What number did I come up with? 128 and 128. So I'm going to have 128 down here. I'm going to drag this down until I have 128. Now make sure you have a 128 and 0, and then up here, look, I have 8 and 128. This is not accurate. I need to drag this up until it's 0 and 128. This is the mistake I made in the previous graph. For Anisha, I have 28 watermelons per acre. So I'm going to do 28 times 16 acres equals 448. My watermelons are on the bottom here, so I'm going to drag my line, and I'm going to drag the first dot, and it's 448 and 0. For the second one, I have 7 pounds of zucchini per acre, so I'm going to do 16 times 7 equals 112. So I'm going to drag this other spot and find 112 and make sure it's 0 and 112. And down here is 0, 448. So this should be my production possibility frontiers for Elijah and Anisha. Now, who has the absolute advantage? If you notice, Anisha can produce more watermelons per pound, but less zucchini per pound. So Anisha has an absolute advantage in the production of watermelons. Elijah has an absolute advantage in the production of zucchini. So we're going to here, and we're going to say that Anisha has the absolute advantage for watermelon. Elijah has the absolute advantage for zucchini. Now let's look at the comparative advantage, which is something else. Elijah's opportunity cost to produce 1 pound of zucchini is going to be, for every extra pound, so if it wants to produce, for example, 8 pounds of zucchini, right? Increase it. What is it going to give up per acre? It's going to give up 28 divided by 7, which is 4. So it's going to give up 4 pounds of watermelon. Whereas Anisha's, oh, I'm sorry, that was Elijah. Elijah's is 1 then, because 8 divided 8 is 1. Anisha's opportunity cost of producing a pound of zucchini is 4 pounds of watermelon. Because Elijah has an opportunity cost, right? Because it has a lower opportunity cost, because it's only giving away 1 pound of watermelon for 1 pound of zucchini. So as a lower opportunity cost of producing zucchini than Anisha, then we can say that Elijah has a comparative advantage in the production of zucchini, and by definition, Anisha will have a comparative advantage in the production of watermelon, because it's going to give up less zucchini. So let's grade it, and we got it all right. I got my graphs correct, and I got all my answers correct. So let's move on to question number 3, gains from trade. We have 2 countries. They produce chinos and pistachios. They have 4 million labor hours per day that can be used to produce chinos. Suppose that initially Glacier uses 1 million hours of labor per day to produce chinos and 3 million per day to produce pistachios. Then you can establish what is their initial production without trade. You don't need to worry about calculating it because it's written down here. Glacier will produce and consume 6 million pairs of chinos and 36 million pounds of pistachios versus the 12 million pairs of chinos and 16 million pounds of pistachios for Congaree. So you don't have to calculate anything. It's just telling you if it dedicated 1 million versus 3 million to the production of each, this is what the result would be. But now the countries have decided that they could trade, right? So first of all, what should they trade? Who has the opportunity cost for chinos versus pistachios? So Glacier's opportunity cost of producing 1 pair of chinos, so we have 6 and 12 for Glacier, is going to be 12 divided by 6, right? So it can produce 2 pounds of pistachio for every pair of chinos. So Glacier's opportunity cost of producing 1 pair of chinos is 2 pounds of pistachios. In the case of Congaree, 16 divided by 4 is 4. So in Congaree, for each chino can produce 4 pounds of pistachios. So in Congaree, the opportunity cost of producing 1 pair of chinos is 4 pounds of pistachios. So who has the comparative advantage? Who has the lowest opportunity cost in producing that extra pair of chinos versus the pistachios? Therefore, we know that Glacier has a lower opportunity cost in producing an extra pair of chinos. So Glacier has a comparative advantage in the production of chinos, and Congaree has a comparative advantage in the production of pistachios. Now suppose that they completely specialize. What did that mean? That the 4 million hours that they have available, they're going to dedicate entirely to the production of one or the other. So since Glacier has the comparative advantage in chinos, they're going to produce only chinos. 6 times 4 is 24 million of chinos a day. Now the country that produces pistachios, how many pounds a day? So Congaree can produce 16 million pounds of pistachios per hour. So 16 times 4. We can use a calculator to be accurate. Times 4 equals 64. So we can write 64 here. So in the following table, now we can decide what the trade decisions are going to be. We know that they're going to trade somewhere in between their individual opportunity costs, because that is the only way that trade will be beneficial, right? So they are going to trade chinos to pistachios at a number that is between 2 and 4 pounds of pistachios per pair of trousers. You don't have to worry about that number because it's given to you. So the country that produces the chinos trades 14 million pairs of pistachios to the other country. So who's producing the chinos? It's Glacier, and it produces 24 pairs a day. So we can go put it in here that with trade, it's going to produce 24 pairs and million pairs, and it's going to produce 0 pistachios. Congaree is going to produce 0 chinos, and Wisor is going to produce 64 million pistachios. We have that part answered. Now, when the two countries did not specialize, the total production of chinos was 18 million per day, and the total production of pistachios was 52 million pounds per day. Because of the specialization, the total production of chinos has increased by, right? So we had started at 18. We now have 24 million that we calculated here. 24 minus 18 is going to be 6. And the total production of pistachio has increased by what? We started with a total production of 52 million pounds per day of pistachios, but now Congaree produces 64 million, so 64 minus 52 is going to be 12. Because the two countries produce more chinos and more pistachios under specialization, each country is able to gain from the trade. So let's see what happens when we trade. We already know that Glacier only produces chinos, so it's going to export them. Export 14 of them, right? If 24 minus 14 is going to give us what's left to Glacier, which is a consumption of 10. Is 10 higher than 6? Sure it is. 10 minus 6, we're going to have an increase of 4. Let's move to the next one. Because it's not producing pistachios, it will import them. And it's going to import 42 million pounds of pistachios. 42 million minus 36 is going to be 6 million pounds. It's going to be 8 million pounds because it's importing all of them in pistachios. So 42 minus 36 is going to be 6. It increased consumptions by 6 million pounds. Let's move on to Congaree. Congaree does not produce chinos, so it's going to import 14 million pairs of chinos versus the 12 that it was originally producing, right? So now their consumption is 14, the whole amount they're importing. 14 minus 12 is going to be 2. And it's going to export pistachios because it's specialized in it, 42. So if we export 42 minus the 64 it was producing, we're going to have what? 22 left to consume. The 22 that it's consuming minus the 16 without trade is going to be 6. So it's gaining 6 million pounds of pistachio to consume thanks to trade. Let's make sure we answered all the parts of the question, and then we can grade it. Okay? So this is how we figure out question number 2. I'm going to skip question number 4 because it's similar to question number 3. You have to determine the comparative advantage between the production of these two countries. The only difference is that the numbers are provided to you on a graph instead of being provided on a table. So when you calculate the opportunity costs, you have 36 million pounds of basil versus 24 million pounds of corn. So you can figure the opportunity cost, the trade-off between switching out from basil to corn, or 18 million pounds of basil versus the 36 million pounds of corn. So you determine who has the comparative advantage between the two, and then based on that comparative advantage, who is going to specialize in basil and who is going to specialize in corn, and you calculate the production after specialization, right? Once you have calculated that, the question gives you the price of trade. It tells you that they're going to trade, in this case, 6 million pounds of corn and 6 million pounds of basil each. So don't be swayed when the answer of this question looks a little bit weird, right? Because initially they were down here at a point of 18 million pounds of basil and 18 million pounds of corn and 9 million pounds of basil. After trade, and actually Shenandoah is only getting 6 million pounds of corn, so it is less than it started at 18, but it is getting more basil. And if you can see, it is a number or a point that is above the production possibility frontier. So the mere fact that it's above here, it means that the resources available to reach that point are not more than what Shenandoah has available, and therefore it needs to trade to reach a point outside of the production possibility frontier, no matter where this point is. It is above. So don't get confused because it looks like they're getting less corn, because the extra basil they're getting is compensating for it, basically. And the same will happen with Denali. Don't get confused. They get less basil and more corn, but the dot, as you can see, is above the production possibility frontier, so there's still a benefit from trade. Now, obviously, your version might play out a little bit different, but it is very similar to question number 3, so I'm going to skip it. And I'm going to go straight to question number 5, which teaches you how to determine the price of trade, because so far the price of trade has just been given to you versus determining what is the price of trade. How do we find out how much they're going to trade? So let's proceed with number 5. Now here you need to be a little bit smart on your answers, in the sense of don't get swayed by all the numbers and get scared by 4, 12 and all of this. So we have Hungary's opportunity cost of producing a pair of shoes is 4 kegs of ale, while Wales' opportunity cost of producing a pair of shoes is 12. So who gives up more to produce a pair of shoes? Wales, right? They have a higher opportunity cost because it's 12 kegs of ale. This means that Hungary has the opportunity cost of producing a pair of shoes as 4 kegs of ale, so they have that comparative advantage. So by comparing the opportunity cost, we can say that who has the comparative advantage in the production of shoes? It's going to be Hungary, and Wales will have a comparative advantage in the production of ale. If you invert it, it would be 1/4 a shoe for each keg of ale and 1/12 of a shoe for each keg of ale. So you know 1/12 is less than 1/4. So Wales has the comparative advantage in kegs of ale. So now suppose that Hungary and Wales consider trading shoes. Hungary will gain from the specialization. So Hungary can already, for each pair of shoes it gives up, can obtain 4 kegs of ale, right? So if it's going to give up any shoes, it needs to receive more than 4 kegs of ale for each pair of shoes it exports to Wales. Similarly, Wales needs to receive more than how many shoes? So the opportunity cost for the shoes for Wales is 1/12, right? Each keg of ale is 1/12 of a shoe, so it needs to receive more than 1/12 pair of shoes for each keg of ale it exports to Hungary. Now here comes the tricky part, and I don't want you to get too lost. I want you to forget the answers you gave here, that is 4 and 1/12 of a pair. Based on your answer to the last question, which of the following price of trade, that is the price of shoes in terms of ale, would allow both Wales and Hungary to gain from the trade? 3 kegs of ale per pairs of shoes, 1 keg, 8 kegs, 18. Well, up here we know that we have 4 kegs of ale and 12 kegs of ale per pair of shoes. So those are the two opportunity costs, and we know that the price of trade needs to be between 4 and 12. So what we're going to look here, which ones are between 4 and 12? 3 is below 4, 1 is below 4, 8 is between 4 and 12, 18 is above 12. So we're only going to select 8 and grade it. And as you can see, it was correct not to select the other 3 and only to select 8. The price of trade has to be between the value of the 2 opportunity costs to be advantageous for both countries. Moving on to question number 6. This is becoming a little bit more graphic, and we're going to look at how we apply that concept of comparative advantage. We always looked at comparative advantage in terms of shoes versus kegs of ale, wheat versus pistachios or stuff like that. But right now what we're going to look at comparative advantage is really who can produce it at a lower price, because at the end of that opportunity cost is the cost of producing an extra bushel of wheat or an extra pound of pistachio, an extra pair of shoes. an extra keg of ale, it's really a monetary cost at the end of the day, right? And in a country, we don't have two goods, but we have multiple goods. So in this case, now we're going to start looking at how do we apply it. When China's clothing industry expands, the increase in the world supply lowers the world of price clothing. Consider the effects this has on both an importer and an exporter of clothing. Suppose the following graph represents the market for clothing in Pakistan. Prior to the expansion of China's clothing industry, Pakistan in this case, so we're looking at this graph, the world price is higher than Pakistan's demand and supply equilibrium, right? So Pakistan can produce and can sell at a lower price than the world price. If they can do that, then it means that they can specialize in the production of clothing and they can sell it abroad. So Pakistan is an exporter of clothing because the world price is above the domestic equilibrium price. There's an incentive for domestic supply to produce more and sell it at the world price, right? That's where they want to sell it at. So we have to use the green points triangle system and the purple points to shade the consumer and produce a surplus areas on the following graphs. There are 2 green points and 2 purple points per graph. Use either one point of both to most accurately indicate the areas. For example, if indicating consumer surplus requires only 1 green point, leave the second one on the palette. So we don't need to use both. What do we know about consumer price surplus and producer surplus? Consumer surplus is the whole area below the aggregate demand curve up all the way to the price charge. So in this case, if Pakistan is going to export clothing, they're going to export clothing and they're going to charge the world price. So the consumer surplus is going to be the area above the price but below the demand curve. Conversely, the producer surplus is going to be the whole area above the supply curve and below the price. So we're going to shade both areas. See, I had to drag it twice because it only shades one at a time. Let me repeat that. See, if I drag it, it's going to shade this area, but I want to shade this other one also. So this is going to be the answer for this part. Now it says on the following graph, let's use the green points to determine consumer and producer surplus after China's clothing industry expands. So after it expands, the world price has gone down because there's more supply of clothing. And what is happening in Pakistan? Consumer surplus, it dragged me, will be a little bigger because they're paying a lower world price. Producer surplus will be a little smaller. There we go. Suppose the following graph represents the market of clothing in Denmark prior to the expansion of China's clothing industry. So we've observed what happens in a country that has a equilibrium price that is below the world price. They're going to be exporters of clothing, and once China expands the industry, their consumers are going to benefit. They're going to have a bigger consumer surplus. Now we're looking at Denmark. Denmark produces at a price that is higher than the world price. This means that Denmark is going to import clothing because they can import at a lower price because the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price. What is the consumer surplus if they become importers? We're going to have shading the whole area below the demand curve, the first one, but there's a little more left here, so we're going to drag the second one. On the other hand, the area left above the supply curve all the way to the price is going to be here, and we're going to shade that in purple. On the following graph, let's use the green point to shade consumer surplus in Denmark after China's clothing industry expands. So now the price has gone further down. So in this case, I don't know why it does that. Consumer surplus is going to be even bigger. You can drag it here. And producer surplus is going to be even smaller than it was before if we compare. It's a smaller triangle. So overall, exporting countries, what does it say here, are affected, benefit, or are harmed by the fall in the world price of clothing, and importing countries have benefit, are not affected, or are harmed. So we know that importing countries benefit the consumer surplus, the whole surplus, total surplus has become much bigger. So when we add producer surplus and consumer surplus, look how much bigger it is in area than this one. Now let's go compare up here what happened. If you notice, yes, consumer surplus was, producer surplus was bigger, has become smaller. And the total area that is shaded between gray and purple has become smaller. So because the price has gone down, Pakistan is actually not going to benefit. Exporting countries are harmed by the fall in the world price of closing. And that was all for this question. Okay, so the last question is going to be question number 7 about the steel industry and what happens when the government gives subsidies. I already have answered this question, so we're going to have to work with the answers already put in. But because the country exports steel, the world price is going to be the price above the equilibrium price. I'm actually going to get rid of this so we can see it properly. Let me put it back here. And I'm going to put this back here, and we're going to use it again after. Okay, so this is equilibrium price domestically, where supply and demand intersect, and the world price is 70. Because the equilibrium price is below, the world price is going to be higher. They're exporters. You're only going to export if you can export for more. So P2. But now what's happening? A pro-trade government wants to subsidize the export of steel by $10. So going back up here, the original price was 70, but now producers can make $80. Now, consumers are not going to pay $80 if they can buy it abroad for 70. So what's going to happen is that the steel produced domestically is going to be imported, and the steel produced domestically, so the supply, is all going to be exported because they can make $70. So with the export subsidy, the price paid to the domestic consumers is still going to be $70, the world price. But what is the suppliers going to receive? They're going to receive $80 per ton from the government. The quantity of steel consumed by the domestic consumer remains unchanged. We go to the demand curve, and for $70, they're still going to buy 300 tons of steel. The quantity of the steel produced by the domestic producers increases, right? Because before, for $70, they would produce 700 tons. But for $80 up here, they're going to produce 800 tons. So the quantity is going to increase of production and of exports. They're producing more because they want to export more. With the export subsidy, this country will start importing steel from abroad. That is true. Yes, we are going to export more, but now we need to import the steel for our domestic consumers because the companies will not sell it for $70 if they can get that subsidy of $10. So now we're going to import this amount. It's 300 tons of steel are going to be imported, and then 700 tons of steel are going to be exported at the price of 80. So this changes a little bit how our consumer and producer surplus works, right? Because now that's what the question is going to ask us, is to figure out, under the export subsidy, consumer surplus is 4,500, producer surplus is 32,000. How did I come up with this? So I got these triangles. What happened? I got these triangles and I dragged and dropped here. So make a nice triangle for the consumer surplus. We know consumer surplus is the whole area that is above the price paid by the consumers but below the demand. Why is it a consumer surplus? Because this section of consumers were willing to pay more than $70 to obtain, but they're only paying $70 because that is the world price. So this is all consumer surplus. Now, the producers, how much are they making? So the producers originally were making only 70, right? So they were making only this. This was the original producer surplus before the subsidy. How much was it? It was 18,000. Now with the subsidy, we increase it to $32,000 to $80, and it's going to be $24,500. That's not correct. $24,500, right? But originally, remember, it was $18,000. So when we calculate the difference between $18,000 and $24,500, we come up $24,500 minus $18,000. It has increased by $6,500. The surplus. But now from this total surplus, we actually need to take out what it's costing the government, because the government revenue decreases by $4,000, and as a total result, the total surplus has decreased. And that is what happens, because now we need to calculate how much the government is paying and how much it's costing the government to subsidize these $10. So the total surplus of the economy, because the government is paying, actually not $4,000, because the government is paying, it went back to an old question. The government is paying $700. Here, $7,000. It's going to pay the $7,000 because it's going to pay the $10 on the whole amount that supply is going to produce at the $80 level. So that was $700. So for $7,000 minus the $6,500, if you compare it to the $6,500 in an extra producer surplus, it's costing the government $7,000. So we're actually losing $500 in total surplus for the economy. What does that mean? Is that this was not an efficient decision. There was not a gain from increasing trade with a subsidy. The government should not have done it. So this ends all the questions. I don't think there's anything else left. Is there? Oh, there's another question. So there's another question of then what would happen if the government introduced a tariff instead of using a subsidy, for example? How does that affect the market? So this question looks a little bit more complicated and it's a little bit more intricate, right? Because there's all these letters A, B, C, D, E, F, and trying to figure out consumer and producer surplus in the presence of a tariff or a tax, right? So having rejected a tariff on textiles. So now we know this is not a tariff on textiles, but it is on it's not a tariff on imports. The president of Isoland is now considering the same sized tax on textile consumption. So it's actually going to impose a tax. What does it mean? Is that the world price remains the same as P with W, but once the goods are imported and they are imported for the world price, but then the government is imposing a tax, is collecting a tax. So it's collecting a tax on both imported and domestically produced textiles, right? We know from the world price that there's a quantity that gets imported and then there's a quantity that gets produced locally that demand can consume. Because at the world price, our supply, domestic supply, only ends at QS1. But demand wants to use QD1 because the world price is so low, right? But now the government has imposed a tax. So what happens to demand? If we look along the demand curve at a higher price, they only want to consume QD with 2. So the quantity demanded is going to decrease from D1 to D2. So compared to the free trade scenario, which is a scenario on the world price, the quantity of textile consumed in Isoland will fall, and the quantity produced in Isoland will remain exactly the same at the world price because the suppliers are not collecting this tax. So it doesn't make any difference for them. So will remain unchanged under a textile consumption tax. That's a tax that imposed on consumption, and it makes no difference for the suppliers because they will receive the world price. The following table shows the effects of an import tariff on the nation on Isoland. So now let's compare the effects of a tariff versus the tax. What would be the difference if it was a tariff, and what would be the difference on the imports? What does that mean for supply? It means that the quantity that's produced domestically can now be sold for a higher price because imposing a tariff on the imports increases the price for the whole amount of quantity sold in the country because the suppliers are also going to impose that higher price. for the goods, for the textiles. So some of the questions are already answered. Consumer surplus. Before the tax, it was A, B, C, D, E, F, right? It's the whole area below the demand curve, that is here, all the way to the world price. So this triangle would have been here, the world price. Let me see if I can write it for you. So originally, this would have been the consumer surplus. This whole area. So A, B, C, D, E, F. That's with free trade. And in fact, it's reflected, it won't let me scroll. It's reflected on the graph down here on the bottom. Now with the world tax, with the consumer tax, what happens though? Let me erase this. What happens to consumer surplus? It changes, right? Because now the consumers are not consuming QD1 anymore, but they're going to consume up here. So our consumer surplus diminishes. And it's going to be only A and B with the tax. So it's just going to be that. Let's go look. So before the tariff, it was A, B, C, D, F. After the tariff, it's going to be only A and B. What changed? We lost D, C, D, E, F as part of the consumer surplus. What happens with the consumption tax? Now with the consumption tax, the consumers are still going to consume less, right? So instead of consuming this whole area again, they're now paying this price because there's that tax imposed. So they're still going to consume only A and B. So after the tax, there's still going to be A and B. So the change is the same. C, D, E, F. It's exactly the same as with the tariff from the consumer's perspective. Whether it's a tariff or whether it's a tax, the consumers end up paying that higher price that incorporates the tariff or the tax. Now things change a little bit for the producers, right? So the producers, how are they affected from the tariff? At first, the producers are only getting G. So if we want to highlight that area, we can highlight it in a different color for the producers, let's say in blue. So this was the original producer surplus in free trade. They're getting the whole area that is below the world price, but above the supply. Now let's go look what happens. After the tariff, they're getting C plus G. So they're earning C. They're earning this whole area. And why are they earning that? Because up to this whole area before on the demand curve is first there's producing this amount at the price, the world price. But now there's the tariff. So the part that they're selling domestically is now has a higher price because there's the tariff added to it. So they can sell domestically all the way up to this second line, and they're going to try to sell a bigger quantity. So they're going to sell QS2. So the area above the supply curve, but that up to the price they can receive is going to be C and G for their domestic. So let me add this. So this is going to be the new producer surplus, C plus G. So now we're earning that C on the producer surplus. So let's go down. Unfortunately, it doesn't all fit on the screen. Right, so producer surplus is going to be C plus G. So we have plus C. There's that change. What happens with the consumption tax for the producers? The producer surplus was G. We add the tax. The consumers are paying the tax, but the producers are not receiving their tax. The price for the producer is still going to be P with W, the world price. So there's really no change for them. So under the consumption tax, the producer surplus is still going to be only G. And so there is no change. We're going to select none for the change under the consumption tax. For the government, before the tariff or the tax, there was no government revenue, made no difference to the government. Now with the tariff, they're going to make a revenue. They're going to have a surplus too, which is going to be this little box here. And let's highlight it with a different color altogether in pink. So the government revenue with the tariff would have been this. Why? Before the tariff, the amount that was being imported was between QS1 and QD1. This whole area was being imported because the price was below the equilibrium price. So this country was importing and they were able to consume this much more at that lower price. But now that the government has imposed a tariff, it basically has increased the price of the import, right? It has increased the price for this country. And so for that higher price, consumers are only willing to consume QD2. Producers are going to produce a little more, but there's this government revenue is only going to be this much on the imports because domestic producers are having the incentive by the higher price to produce a little more domestically. So we're going to import a little less, and the government is going to make E, this square box, as their revenue from the imports. So let's go look, and it says E plus E. Now what happens with the consumption tax? The government revenue is going to increase. And how much is it going to increase by? Now, with the revenue for the government's going to make this whole area, it's going to collect the tax from the purchase, right? But the quantity sold is going to decrease to QD1 again. So the quantity sold decreases by the same amount. From QD1 to QD2. It's going to go up here. But now the government is not just collecting E. It's actually going to collect a tax for the whole amount sold domestically, which is everything, because it's not collecting the tax only for what it's importing. It's collecting the tax for everything. So the government is going to get CDE. Let's go find it on here. CDE. So what is the change from what it was originally? It's going to be CDE is the change, right? So now we have to calculate the total surplus. Before the tax or tariff, the total surplus was everything, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. With the tariff, we lost F. Let me see, A, B, C, and we lost D also. So this is the change, the loss in the market in surplus by imposing the tariff. What is the loss by imposing the consumption tax? So comparing the tariff versus the tax. We had A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So we still have A, B, C, D, E, but we don't have F anymore. So this is going to be the change. First, we're going to do the total minus the F. A, B, C, D, E, G. And the change is going to be the F. So in comparison, the total surplus, there's a bigger loss in total surplus with a tariff than there is with a consumption tax. Unfortunately, my graph is half cut, and we can't see it all. Oh, here it is. So with the F, we'll be able to see that there's only, there's a smaller loss. Instead of losing D and F, we're only losing F. So it would be better for the government to impose the tax than to impose the tariff. Compared to the consumption tax, the tariff raises less revenue for the government because, right, the government's only making E instead of making CD plus E, and has a larger deadweight loss associated with it. So the tariff is worse than the government tax. So this concludes. When you're done, you would click yes, submit the assignment now, and it would submit your grade, and it would transfer to Brightspace. You close your window, and then you can go back to working on anything else that you have to start working off. I hope this clarifies the question for Module 2 quiz, and it helps with kind of learning how to develop the questions for Module 3.